All right, welcome to the Week 10 Forum. We're dealing with historical research, and I mentioned that I'm a little bit more comfortable with the last couple of weeks' material from a methodological perspective, mainly because these are both areas that are kind of right in my graduate school wheelhouse. And again, the value of history is that it helps us understand context. And again, this is similar to kind of reflects the idea that, when we were talking in earlier chapters about the whole idea about different ontologies. And a historical approach is basically telling us that we have to understand language and we have to understand the extent to which we are, again, immersed in historical periods. And we need to do a better job of understanding the past in order to understand our present and of course, to forecast our future. Um, we've been talking about, I think I mentioned in one of the forums the whole idea, and then I think several of you mentioned the idea of Theda Skocpol's book, and I'm going to show it to you because I have it. I have that book, and here's another good example, and this is actually, it also illustrates the extent to which political science, history, and sociology are pretty tightly interwound. This book right here is another classic. It was written in 1966 by an American sociologist by the name of Barrington Moore Jr. And the title of the book, if you couldn't read it, was The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And it's, again, considered a classic work in what we might call modernization. And Moore's investigations, and I think we should read more as part of a wave of scholarship that's coming in the mid and late 1960s. Um, I want to say Samuel Huntington's work on modernization was coming out about the same time. And again, what they're worried about and what they're concerned about is this idea of a transition from a transitional, from a traditional kind of society where power is basically held in sort of a strongman, authoritarian, monarchical fashion to a more modern society. And Moore's argument, and again, this is a thick book if you look at it. His basic argument is that there are ultimately going to be three pathways available to the developing world, or if you want to say the countries of the global south. He basically said they can become more democratic, they can become fascistic, or they can succumb to the siren song of communism. And Moore's argument is that if you can develop a middle class, that the likelihood of these countries developing and emerging as more democratically oriented societies is much greater. And really, the the basics of his book can be boiled down to uh, one simple phrase: no bourgeoisie, no democracy. And I think that that's what makes that both an interesting argument and also again it kind of highlights um, how we look at things from a historical perspective. Um, because how does a bourgeoisie form? What are the factors that lead to the creation of a relatively independent middle class that can act sufficiently with sufficient energy to actually compel a moderating effect over our governing institutions? How did that happen? And and I think it pairs really well, like of course, with Skocpol's argument as well, because she looks at the three great social upheavals in the modern era: the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and she's basically saying these kinds of thoroughgoing, you know, uh, comprehensive revisions of an entire country's, kind of governing DNA. These kinds of things don't occur in a vacuum. They occurred in these three places for clear reasons, right? And she's identifying basically first of all, the fact that there is a large, fairly grievance-laden peasantry in presence in all three, in the three countries. We don't often think of France that way, but pre-revolutionary France was still very feudal in its political arrangements. And likewise, of course, with their, in both Russia and in China, you had an enormous percentage of their population that were just on the ground, pressed down, oppressed by by political forces. They were not the only country that was dealing with that kind of situation, though. And she very frequently draws on other examples. For example, Prussia. How did Prussia manage to avoid, going that pathway? How did Japan end up going down that pathway? And what, her argument, I think, is absolutely correct, and that is that the threat of foreign intervention didn't ultimately disrupt the conflict between elites that was taking place in those three countries. They kept fighting, and they ultimately lost control of the country. In Prussia, the German, the Junker class never lost control. Neither, in Japan. The Meiji Restoration was a demonstration that the political elites understood the threat and were prepared to make accommodations. And again, the problem with social revolutions as opposed to political revolutions, we can contrast the two by basically saying political revolution, are basically just tinkering with the institutions. Social revolutions are saying, let's just throw everything up on the air and see how it comes down. That's those kinds of thoroughgoing, revolutionary activities are generally going to be a function of these instances where populism lacks a plausible counterbalance, and where, basically the resentments and the grievances of a great mass of people are allowed to basically run unchecked. And so, this is the kind of thing, when you look at this chapter, again, these ideas of temporality and, and to me, one of my favorite concepts, which I use a lot in my other classes, the idea of path dependence, is really important. And it's one of the reasons I think why history is still so relevant. I think, the whole idea of path dependence is captured in George Santayana's, I don't want to, it's a trite phrase, but, those who don't understand the past are condemned to repeat it. It's not true. The past doesn't repeat itself, but the past is informed. Our present and our future is informed by what has happened. Doors closed in the past remain closed in the future, and can only be opened with great effort. And they, again, you close one door and a vista of doors open in front of you. But they're conditioned by those doors that are closed and the door that you went through in the past. And I think that's important when you think about, especially these kinds of things. These countries are, especially with Russia and China, they continue to be dealing with the consequences of having thrown everything up in the air. And France's politics, I think, continues to be incredibly volatile in ways that many other European countries do not, simply, again, because of the consequences of something that happened, 200 years ago, right? So again, as we look at these chapters, as we look at this material, always remember, if there's anything that you don't get, please, ask me a question. I do read these forums, and I try to reply as, best I can. Obviously, I'm very busy, and I'm trying to work ahead so that I can deal with my health situation later on in the semester. So again, anything that I can do to help you, I want to do. So let's have a great week of discussion, and let's learn a lot.